Hello. In this video, we'll start discussing writing. This is, again, a reminder that this is a writing intensive course, so we will have both essays on all of our exams, and not essays, but some extra examples, some things that are going to require some extra explanation. Hopefully you've already watched both the Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 videos, so you're already starting to get some of that understanding, and we'll explain a little bit more of that. What does it take to fully answer a question, to give a good example? So we'll get into some of that. But on top of that, we're also going to have 3 writing assignments. So the formal writing assignments, our first one is probably going to come up as we get a little bit into Chapter 3, and is going to be a little bit more of an intro. A little bit of a look at how statistics works, is a little bit of a big picture, just trying to get some basic idea. And that first assignment, the basic goal, is to make sure that you have the right structure. The second writing assignment is going to be where I give all of you the same data, and that you are going to be responsible for putting it all together, for organizing the data, getting a lot of the values, and then discussing what it means, what are the possibilities, what are some speculations that we can make, but also trying, again, as we always say, pointing out not to take those results too far, to realize what else we might want to know to help make those conclusions even better. The third writing assignment is going to be very particular to each one of you. It's going to be about how statistics can help you. And there'll be several examples you have to give about you as a person, you as someone who works in your future field, whatever that may be. So we'll explain each of those individually, but just to give you a little bit of a sense, to be honest, in regular semesters, I normally structure my writing assignments to keep building so that the final writing assignment is you go out, pick your own statistical project, you go collect the data, organize it, run it, do the analysis, talk about, what are the possibilities, what are some of the conclusions, what are other things we want to know, how it could be extended, trying to build towards that. But with the current situation, most students prefer to collect their data in person, and it's just not a good idea to be doing that. So that's why I've done the 3 that we mentioned. And like I said, we'll have separate videos for each one discussing all the little particulars. So still want to talk more about the general writing structure, but let's now talk a little bit more about the essays portion. I'll tell you right off the bat, your final exam, there's going to be a big essay where you are going to go back, I think it was a 6-step process to analysis, statistical analysis, that we discussed at the beginning of Chapter 1. You are going to take an example and go through all those steps in an essay question. So again, we've got a lot before we can understand all of those steps, but still already seeing giving an example to satisfy something. The Chapter 2 video, we talked about 3 different situations, 3 different types of questions, but they all involve examples. Why do we sample over using the population? You should be able to give an example to support that. The differences between observational and experimentation, between observation and experimentation. Give an example of each to help illustrate it. And then the last one, an example of bias. Have a statistical situation and being able to discuss potential bias, how it could affect the data, how we can try and avoid that bias. So those types of questions. So in an essay, what is a structure? And I'm calling all those things essays. Essay, short answer. What is the structure? Very quickly, I want to say, I'm going to give you, I think, what is very good general advice, but certainly as you go to other particular classes, some professors have very specific criteria they're looking for, so always include that. But in an essay, the general idea is jump right in, right? You don't need any introduction. You really can. What is the question? Let me jump right in. So we're talking about, again, why do we sample? Well, we could jump right in. We need to sample because there are certain situations where the population is simply too large. It would cost too much money. It would take too much time to go and collect all the data. That is a full example that is explaining, giving the example, explaining enough about the example so anybody reading it, whether they've been in this class or they're completely outside of this class, they can clearly see all the connections you are making. Or the same thing with the bias question. that if I was going to conduct a survey and I wanted to know about, how long it takes for people to commute, well, what are potential bias? Well, as long as I don't ask any misleading questions, there are a lot of things to be said. But to fully answer it, it all really needs to be detailed. But the essay, you jump right in. You give that example, you give that initial statement, your own take, and then start connecting that example to why that example fits that situation. That's the idea on an essay. Now, if I ask you to speculate, if I ask you to personalize anything, we will get to a point where I'll give you information, things like, here are a bunch of salaries from a particular company. Here are the ages of people who live in an apartment building. Here are the test scores from a particular class. And then I ask you a question about just based on this information, do you want to work for that company? Do you want to live in that building? Would you want to be a member of that class? When you're asked things like that, or when you're asked to speculate, tell me something about something you may think based on this information, something you may think about the type of job or the workers, or about the type of class, or about the nature of the building. We're going to see questions like that. So what is speculation? Well, speculation is not just literally repeating data to me. Well, I speculate that people in this building are older because I noticed there are a lot of people aged 60 and 70 in the building. That's not speculation. That's just simply repeating, presumably, what either the data itself, or a chart that we are given. That's literally repeating something that anybody can see. Speculation would be, well, maybe this happens to be a home for retired workers because I noticed that there were a lot of people age 70 or above. Or this seems to be an apartment building for new families because I noticed there are lots and lots of very young age kids in the building. That's the idea of speculation. I think these bunch of workers all have a high level degree because they all have a high salary. Or I think these are a bunch of workers that are just starting out. Maybe people who just have a high school diploma because their salaries are lower. That this is a very difficult class or an upper level class because I noticed the test grades are lower. Or, again, that's speculation. Looking at the data and, using our outside experiences, other examples that we've seen before to think about a possibility. But it's not just a random possibility, it's a possibility that makes sense with the data that is given. If I ask you to personalize that, do you want to be a member of that class? Do you want to live in that building? Most of these are yes or no questions, but you always should back it in some way. Yes, I would like to work for that company because the salaries are really high and it's more than I make now. Or, I have to say, in all these examples, whether it's formal papers or in essays, some people, they're naturally funny. When I kind of think about when these situations, grab often the first or second idea, take what comes to the front of your brain. And for some people, naturally funny things jump to the front. That's fine. The building example, I've given that on a test before. And I've given a situation where there are a lot of older and younger people in the building. But the one year when it was a lot of older people in the building, and I asked you, would you want to live in the building? And some people respond with well, no, I'm 22, 25, 19, whatever. I'm this age, and there aren't many people of my age who live in the building. I like there to be some, so at least there's a possibility I can make a friend. That's a very natural, good answer that matches up with the data. But sometimes, people are silly. I had a student who one time wrote, well, I wouldn't want to live in that building because there seems to be a lot of older people, and I think older people smell. I gotta admit, I laughed when I read that. And we don't want to have other, we want to make sure if we use our other experiences that it's not, stereotypes. That it's not other bad things and other bias that we may have. We try to avoid that. But again, when you are basing things off your experience, again, I can't fault you for that. So again, we try, and there's nothing wrong. Like my main point though is there's nothing wrong with trying to be funny, but there's no extra points for being funny. Okay, so don't go out of your way to try and make up a silly example. There's nothing wrong. I'm looking for, does the example match? Or if I'm asking you your opinion, do you give your opinion with a reason to go with it? That's all I'm looking for. So in a lot of those things, there's no right or wrong. It's just simply, are you saying something with any kind of backing behind it? But it always takes the backing. That's the big part. Does your example match what I'm asking for? Well, you should be able to clearly link that it does this, and that's what we're being asked for. Or if we're speculating that the data says this, and again, that is somewhat reasonable based on my other experiences. By the way, you could always ask, right? That's one of the big things is we keep going and people want to say, well, is this enough? Does this discuss? We can always continue to talk about that and we'll get better. But I wanted to give you that sense before we get to any formal collection, before we have any tests, before we have any formal papers. Oh, so same thing. Examples, comparisons, made up. You know, the book, I like that in the book itself, there are a lot of real examples where they have actually gone and looked at magazine articles and, you know, journals of medicine and business and things of that nature to get some real examples. But whenever I ask you for one, make it up. There's nothing wrong with that at all, to just make up and say, okay, well, we did an example like this with salaries, so maybe now I can do it based off of health insurance, or I can do it based off of contributions. You know, there's so many easy ways to tweak an example we've done so that you have a new, fresh example. And like I said, completely fine to be made up. Okay. So that gets through a lot of our essays, just as far as what am I looking for. So a lot of these problems, again, it's not just give an example of this and it's done in a sentence. It often takes a couple of sentences. A sentence to explain something, a sentence to give the example itself, and then maybe another sentence to connect it. Now maybe it works that it all kind of fits into one big compound sentence, but just that's the overall structure. How do you know you're doing it correctly? That you're hitting all of those components. That you're clearly, you know, if it's an example, that you're clearly giving it. If I'm asking for an opinion, that you're clearly giving it. But also making sure that it's matching, that you're explaining a comparison, that you're explaining the difference between, you know, observation and experiment, and that your examples highlight those differences. Okay, so now back to papers, the formal papers. 3 components. Every formal paper you hand in should have 3 components. Your introduction, the body, and then the conclusion. And all 3 of these, we have people who go nuts on all of these. Some people, for the introduction, you know, how long should your introduction be? I'm not going to try and give you any clear-cut idea, but it should never be half of your paper, okay? An introduction should be just that, a general introduction. And same thing like I said with examples. When we get to papers, some people are very much here's the assignment, this is what I'm doing, and they move in a very methodical manner. I know I'm a person like that, but I always give you the freedom, make up a scenario that fits that data. So when I give you the test data, I'm going to ask you to make some speculation. So some people just start cut and dry. Here was class A, here was class B, this is what I got, this is what I have, and then they eventually move to their speculation. Other people, right from the get-go, it's like they have more fun with it. They kind of assume class A is a math class B is an English class, or class A meets early in the morning, and class B meets in a regular afternoon time slot. It's like they've already thought a lot about the paper, and they've already thought about some of those possibilities, so they could write the whole paper based around that. That this is the initial circumstance, still have to go through, collect the information, tell us what it says, still thinking about more that we could advance, tell us more, other possibilities, if there is any possibilities for bias and things of that nature. So it still all works out the same, but at the beginning, your introduction, a general introduction, not, I have to say another big problem that comes up in statistics. Every paper I give, people write me 2 pages about what is statistics. Is the paper entitled What is Statistics? Well, then that makes sense. But if the paper is about analyzing these test grades, giving examples that highlight how statistics can be used, personalizing it to your own, any of those situations, you do want to give a quick what is statistics about. But again, it's quick. It's a couple of sentences about statistics in general, and then you come down to, in this paper, what am I going to do? So your introduction, for a lot of people, a paragraph, maybe two, some general introduction. Sometimes that general intro, we need to know, again, especially when I used to give, you did your own project, you collected your own information. Well, sometimes students, based on their information, they had to, share some information at the beginning. One guy had his own little business. He did it on the side. He sold sneakers. So he took a paragraph to tell me about his business, how he got started a little bit, what he was doing, what his goals were. Makes sense as an intro, and then getting into at the end the specifics of what he's going to do with statistics and his business. Another student, he was on a cricket team. I was honest with him, I don't really know that much about cricket. So at the beginning of the paper, it made a lot of sense, just explaining a little bit about cricket, how the scoring works in cricket, and then again, what he's going to do in his paper, and analyze how his performance was to the rest of his team. So all those different situations, it's like, it makes sense, and again, you need an introduction, and sometimes there has to be a little bit of a longer introduction sometimes, but a paragraph or two. That should really, really be more than enough. And the second aspect of an introduction, you need a thesis statement. You need a statement of intent. So all this, the idea of, some general, give your reader, and because again, I keep saying it, essays, papers, you don't have to give them to someone in statistics to get a second opinion, to double check. You should be able to hand these papers to anyone, a friend, a sibling, a parent, a coworker, and they should be able to give you feedback. Because if you're doing a good job, you should provide. And if they're asking questions because they don't understand, that should be a clear-cut answer for you that you need to explain some more. So the idea of, in general, okay, you give your reader a little bit of the broad picture of the topic, of statistics, of whatever it is you're looking at, but there still should be a sentence of intent. Now, stylistically, I do not consider myself to be the best writer. Like I said, I'm kind of a very clear-cut, let me just follow. For me, my writing is based much more of just logic. It just, this follows it and this, and that's how I base my work. But you still need to, again, have some statement of intent. You've set a little bit of a broad picture, but then you need to have that declaration. I don't mind in this class, you could always make it this, in this paper, I am going to blank, blank, and blank. So even though, again, we discussed my sneaker business in general, but in particular, I'm going to look at my sales for the last month and try and determine if my new strategy is working, or if this particular brand is selling better. Or again, I'm going to look at my individual scoring in this game, or how long it takes me to get to work in the morning, and then compare it to my coworkers. Or someplace there should be that statement of intent. Now, like I was saying, some people would say you shouldn't write it in that I form. And, again, in different classes, what person? Are you writing in the first person, that you are the individual? I went and collected this data. I looked at these test grades. I am doing this. Are you writing as more of a story in a third person narrative? The data was collected and teacher A seems to have done it, You shouldn't switch tenses. There's other writing, stylistic and grammar we could talk about. But as we keep suggesting, it's not about style. It's not about grammar. This is all about content, the quality of the content. So that's why I do come back to the full permission. You can say, I will do this. For a lot of people, it's kind of that last sentence of the first paragraph, that first sentence of the second paragraph, but it all kind of fits into the intro. You've given your audience this nice little broad picture, but then before they get too far into the paper, the clear direction, where is this paper going? So I have to admit, those are two big pet peeves of mine. People who don't give an intro, You're definitely going to lose points on every paper for that. People who don't give enough of an intro, or people who give way too much and never lead their reader. I have had papers that, what are our papers? The first one's like 2 pages, the second one is like 4 to 5, the third one is like 3 or 4. So again, it's a little bit of a ballpark, but I have definitely had papers in the past where I'm reading, it's 5 pages, and I'm on the 5th page and I still don't know what the point of the paper is. That's bad. That's just, there's lots of information. I'm not saying the information itself was bad, but there was never any clear indication of what the point was, and then all of a sudden the paper was over. So that's kind of that first part. Every person reading, without getting too far in, clear-cut big picture of what's going on and the clear-cut idea of what is the main goal. Then you get into those particulars. So I have collected this data and this is my results. This is what I'm getting. I organized it and looked on this chart. I think of this example and this is what made me think to build on. Now you start getting into the very particulars, the body. Now once we start getting to the particulars of the paper, we can try and identify a little more structure of the body, some nice getting, if I'm asking you to give several examples, maybe you want to structure each example as its own paragraph. So we can get a little bit further into that, but the body is the meat of it. That's where all of the what else are you doing with the paper, that's where most of it happens. You gave a broad picture in the beginning, you identified a little bit of like a clear-cut goal, but now in the body itself, you're explaining that. I went and did this, I collected this, this is what we found, this is what it means. That's where we get with the body, and then we finish with a conclusion. There should be no new information in your conclusion, okay? The conclusion is kind of your summary. The conclusion is where you kind of go back and point out, this is what I wanted to do. Some people almost kind of like restate their thesis statement and then try and do a quick highlight of how they accomplished that goal and how they demonstrated what they were after. Now, I mean, sometimes, especially when you start getting to like formal lab reports and things like that, in that conclusion is where you also get the extras of like, well, what else does it mean? Where else do we extend? That does make sense. So for some people, the conclusion, well, no new information should be presented, but it does make sense in your conclusion to get to that last part of what are the follow-ups. Now that I've done this, this would be good information to collect to help expand my answer. Or I should then go, try and get more people involved to see if my results still hold, if I increase my sample size. So we can get a little bit of that, but like I said, the most part, if you really want to look at the big 3, introduction, get your audience started, give them a broad picture, but also give them a clear-cut goal or goals is what you're going to do. The body, get to work. Do all those things you said you were going to do. And then finally, your conclusion, sum it up. Remind your audience what they started with, what happened, and, again, any of the little extras that should be considered. So that's it for this video. Again, we'll continue. We're not done talking about writing. We'll continue to talk about writing as we develop, especially the essays and stuff. As we have already done, we'll continue to talk about that in the instructional videos themselves. And then we'll have separate videos to discuss the writing projects. And we can, again, as we get this specific information for the writing project, start to discuss a little bit more of the formal nature. This is a good idea for an intro. These are good ideas for paragraph structure and other things like that.